That's how you reconcile it, by creating your own gospel. What were the women at the tomb told to tell the disciples? Were the disciples supposed to stay in Jerusalem, or were they supposed to go to Galilee to see Jesus? It depends which gospel author you read. Did the women tell anyone what they saw or not? It depends which gospel you read. All of these differ depending on which gospel you read. Did the disciples leave Jerusalem to go to Galilee, or did they stay in Jerusalem? Did they never leave, or did they leave right away? It depends which gospel you read. These gospels are all different from one another in their details. Are they the kind of sources that historians would rely upon for historical information? I would argue that, in fact, these are not the kinds of sources that can be relied upon by historians. And the Gospels are theological documents. They're not historically accurate documents. My conclusions about the Gospel narratives: these are not reliable historical accounts. The accounts that we have are based on oral traditions that have been in circulation for decades. Year after year, Christians trying to convert other people. They had an intention when they told these stories. They told these stories in order to convince other people that Jesus was raised from the dead. The authors who wrote down these stories decades later were not eyewitnesses. They were Greek-speaking Christians living 35 to 65 years after the events that they narrate. These authors are telling stories that Christians had been telling during those years. There was no one there at the time of Jesus' death taking notes. The stories, many of them were actually invented. Most of the stories were in fact changed. For these reasons, the gospel accounts are not as useful as we would like them to be for historical sources. They're not contemporary, they're not disinterested, they're not consistent with one another. Now, as emphatic as I've tried to be about that, the reality is what I've just told you the last 15 minutes is not the big problem. The big problem with arguing that the resurrection can be proved by historians is something else. It's a major obstacle that no historian can overcome no matter what. This is the obstacle. Historians, by their very nature, try to establish what probably happened in the past. You can't repeat the experiment of the past. That's why you have people who can deny that certain things that almost certainly happened. The University of Tennessee, ranked #1 in college basketball, lost the game 3 nights ago. We in Chapel Hill are glad to know. It's almost certain, but you can't repeat it. How do you know? Well, you have newspaper accounts. But you can't repeat the experiment. Did the Holocaust happen? Yes. But people deny it. Why? Because you can't repeat the experiment. Historians can only establish what probably happened in the past. And what are miracles exactly? Well, Mike has already told us what miracles are. Miracles, in any given instance, are the least probable occurrence. They violate what we think of as the natural working of the natural order. If they weren't spectacularly unusual, they wouldn't be miracles. By definition, miracles are the least probable occurrence. No human being in this room can walk on water. What are the chances that anyone can walk on water? Well, the chances are less than 1 in 5 billion because there's nobody on the planet who can walk on water unless the water happens to be frozen. Can you demonstrate that somebody ever probably walked on water? Not if it's the least probable occurrence for something having happened. The probabilities are infinitesimally remote. So too with the resurrection of Jesus. I am not saying, and I want to be emphatic about this point, I am not saying that Jesus was not raised from the dead. That's not my argument. My argument is that if Jesus was raised from the dead, historians cannot prove it because of the nature of historical evidence. A theologian may say that it's true, and then you'd have to argue about it on theological grounds, but the historian cannot show it. The historian's dilemma is this: how can the least probable occurrence, a miracle, ever be the most probable? By definition, it's the least probable occurrence. Historians can never establish the least probable occurrence as being the most probable, which means historians can never establish that the resurrection ever happened. It cannot be proved by historians. Maybe it happened, maybe it didn't happen, but you can't use historical evidence to prove it. Now, Mike's going to say, well, that means that you can't test the truth claims of Christianity using history. And that's absolutely right. You cannot. Just as you cannot use mathematics to prove the truth claims of Christianity, or chemistry to prove the truth claims of Christianity. The reality is, historians cannot prove what is the least probable occurrence as having happened in the past. Our sources are contradictory and late and not by eyewitnesses, and historians simply cannot prove miracles because of the nature of the case. That prove that Jesus was raised from the dead historically. The facts are that Jesus died by crucifixion, number one. Number two, that his disciples afterwards came to believe that he had been raised from the dead on the basis of what they said were appearances to them. Number two. And then number three, that the Apostle Paul converted. First, let me point out that I don't see that he actually has three rock-solid facts that point to the resurrection. Take fact number one, that Jesus was crucified. How exactly does the crucifixion of Jesus provide evidence that he was raised from the dead? There were thousands of people who were crucified in the first century. Is this evidence that thousands of people were raised from the dead? Some people have a mistaken idea, of course, that Jesus alone was crucified. And when you see artistic representations, often, of course, you'll see Jesus nailed to the cross and the two robbers tied to the cross. Have you noticed that? Why is that? Well, it's to show that Jesus suffered more than anyone else. In fact, lots of people suffered crucifixion. In the year 70, when the Roman general Titus overthrew Jerusalem after a 2.5-year siege of the city of Jerusalem, they breached the city walls. They went in to slaughter the opposition. Titus crucified all of the opposition, so much so he ran out of lumber. Crucifixion was a common form of execution in the Roman Empire for the lowest of the low. The fact of crucifixion simply shows that Jesus was executed for some kind of crime against the state. It has no relevance to whether he was raised from the dead, any more than the crucifixion of anyone else is evidence that he was raised from the dead. So we no longer have three rock-solid facts that point to resurrection. We have two. The crucifixion is irrelevant to the question. So let's look at these two. The disciples believed in Jesus because he allegedly appeared to them, and Paul was converted. Now, by my reasoning, those two are actually one, because Paul is one of the people who claimed that he saw Jesus alive afterwards and was converted on the basis of that appearance. Now, true, some of the people who converted were probably Jesus' followers, and Paul was not a follower, but it's the same phenomenon we're looking at. The phenomenon is that Jesus allegedly appeared to people after his death. So let's take on that as a piece of evidence. That is the only piece of evidence that Mike has marshaled, namely that people claim to see Jesus alive after his death. So we have one fact that I agree with. There were people who claimed they saw Jesus alive after his death. The question is, can a historian on the basis of that fact establish that Jesus was probably raised from the dead? I'd like to look at several considerations. First, I'm a little puzzled that Mike hasn't looked at parallel phenomenon in the ancient world. As it turns out, there are numerous instances of ancient people who were dead as doornails, who allegedly appeared to their close companions and followers after their death. Were all of these people raised from the dead? Let me give you one example. A famous holy man in the first century, a pagan holy man, was named Apollonius. He was from the city of Tyana. We know about Apollonius and the life of Apollonius because one of his later followers wrote down an account of his life. Apollonius had a life that was very interesting indeed. Before he was born, an angelic visitor came to his would-be mother and told her that she was going to bear a special son. her son would not be a mere mortal. Her son would be the Son of God. He was born supernaturally. After his birth, as a young boy, he impressed the teachers of his people with his religious knowledge.